What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where I, Graham G. Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. Today we're talking the latest episode of Table for Three called Table of Honor, featuring former Ring of Honor star Cesaro, formerly known as Claudio Castagnoli, Seth Rollins, formerly known as Tyler Black, and Nigel McGuinness, who did not have to go through a name change upon coming to WWE. I love episodes like this. I love Table for Three in general. But I love the idea of an episode being devoted to like another promotion. Now, of course, WCW and ECW are a whole other thing, which they've done before here on Table for Three. I cannot tell you how many WCW devoted episodes we've had of Table for Three over the last 4 years. But very few times did they actually devote an episode to TNA, Impact, Ring of Honor stuff. They didn't do an Impact episode, but they did an episode a while back where they talked a lot about Impact with, like, I think maybe Matt Hardy. He's talked a lot about Broken, being the whole Broken saga, whatever. I know Kurt Angle has talked about it here on the show before. I'm not sure if they did an entirely TNA episode, but they have talked a lot about TNA here on the show over the last year or so. This episode was entirely devoted to Ring of Honor. They outright said Ring of Honor like no less than 100 times on this episode, which was really cool. I don't know why in 2019 they can't do a whole Impact episode, but whatever. They kind of made it sound like Ring of Honor. I mean, obviously it was very integral to their respective careers, 10 years ago when they first started out, but they made it sound like Ring of Honor was a thing of the past. Now, Nigel did say at one point, like, they have money now, which is great, which we'll talk more about, momentarily. But they made it sound like Ring of Honor was a lot like ECW, where it helped get them to where they are today, but it's no longer around, which is the farthest thing from the case. I don't want to say Ring of Honor's thriving nowadays. I mean, I think Ring of Honor is great. I really enjoy the product. I don't think it was what it used to be, 10, 15 years ago, but even a year or two ago when they had the Elite. Ever since the Elite left, and I've said this before, they kind of lost a lot of the buzz they had surrounding the product. It really feels like Ring of Honor's flown under the radar, for worse, not for better, since the Elite left late last year. But that's in a whole other video for another day. We kick off this episode with Seth Rollins showing off his Universal Championship, so I assume this was taped shortly after WrestleMania 35. They usually tape a lot of these episodes over WrestleMania weekend, but of course at this point Rollins is already the Universal Champion, so it might have been taped Monday, Tuesday, whatever, shortly after the pay-per-view, because they talk a lot about him winning the championship at the beginning of this episode. He also talks about the Velcro on the championship belt, which I think that was put into place about a year ago, if not at the onset of 2019, where they replaced the, not the straps, but like on the straps of the championship, they had like the, it would just snap right in place. They don't have the snappers anymore. They have Velcro. I think that's still in place unless they changed that again. And Rollins just had like a transitional replica title. I don't think they have the snappers anymore. I think it's all about the Velcro. And even Rollins said, I don't know how I feel about that because it was such an old school thing to have, to snap the championship in place around your waist. And they don't have that anymore. But anyway, Cesaro says that Rollins and Lesnar was one of the best WrestleMania openers he's ever seen. And I got to agree, not from like an in-ring standpoint, but from like a pure moment standpoint in terms of getting the show off to a hot start. I got to agree. Rollins does mention, hey, Bryan and Triple H is up there too from WrestleMania 30. I would also throw in Bret Hart and Owen Hart from WrestleMania 10. But yeah, I would say Rollins and Lesnar and Rollins becoming the new Universal Champion definitely ranks high up there as one of the best WrestleMania openers of all time. And even Bryan and Triple H, I mean, I guess you could consider that an opener, but really that WrestleMania 30 show opened with Stone Cold, Rock, and Hogan in that three-way promo segment. But even that was an amazing opener, so you can include that as well. But anyway, Nigel asks Seth Rollins, he says, when did you find out that you were opening the show? And I know there were like reports from Meltzer at the time saying, he's going to open the show like days in advance. Apparently it was not finalized until like the fucking Women's Battle Royal. Rollins says, yeah, there were a couple text exchanges and, phone calls and emails and whatever. Shortly afterward, I found out during the Women's Battle Royal on the fucking kickoff show, right before the main show started, that I would be opening the event. And, Nigel asks him, did you have any time to be nervous? And Rollins said, no, I didn't have any time to be nervous at all, to really digest it, whatever. I just went out there and did my thing. They talk about Rollins being champion. Nigel says that he remembers always being in pain while he was in Ring of Honor. at least when he was the world champion, because he was always, putting his body through so much. And we talked a lot about that in the documentary that they put out on Nigel earlier this year, late last year, which was tremendous stuff. Check it out if you haven't already, where he talked about he was in pain a lot during his time in Ring of Honor because of the style that he worked at the time. But he does say, Cesaro asks him how he feels now, and he says he feels better now than he ever has. Rollins also admits that he has felt sore now. Maybe not now, but he did for like a solid 6-year period. Because his body wasn't used to being on the road so much and not sleeping in his own bed. And he felt sore there. Maybe not like outright injured, but he was sore for at least 6 years, he said, which is incredible to me. And like, not in a good way, but like, holy shit, like you went that long being hurt. I'm sure now is not any different, being on the road constantly as a Universal Champion and being a top star, but nonetheless, Cesaro and Nigel talk about when they first met at the Ted Petty Invitational, which I guess they call it the TPI. It was like a tournament or something like that they did annually. It must have been an independent wrestling thing. I have no, knowledge of it. Back in 2004, Rollins says that while he wasn't on the show, he was at the show. You can see him visibly when they show the footage of Cesaro and Nigel wrestling each other at that show. You can see Seth in the crowd, which is, again, amazing. So Rollins remembers being at that show, seeing all the amazing talent on the card: Roderick Strong, Samoa Joe, Cesaro, Nigel, the list goes on and on and on. Daniel Bryan. He also says, Rollins does, that he was terrified to get in the ring with Nigel because he knew that he'd be in for the beating of his life when he wrestled Nigel McGuinness. Nigel says that he used to throw a pretty bad clothesline, but it wasn't until, of all people, fucking Mark Jindrak, whatever you want to... I don't know exactly how you pronounce it. I always forget. Mark Jindrak, whatever, taught Nigel how to throw a proper clothesline after Jindrak had left WWE, years earlier in, the mid-2000s. Nigel and Cesaro recall wrestling each other. We see footage of their matches from the mid-2000s. And Rollins talks about how the holds they would do in Ring of Honor really separated what they were doing at that time from what WWE was doing at that time. But he also says it's changed so much because the style Ring of Honor was doing at that time, we see so much now in WWE, it doesn't feel special anymore. And he says you can't get away with just doing rest holds now. I mean, maybe in like Ring of Honor or whatever, or on a smaller show or an NXT or whatever, but definitely not on the main roster. You can't get away with just doing rest holds now because it's boring. Or not rest holds, but like, holds and, focusing on body parts. It's great wrestling. Cesaro says we still kind of see that now in NXT UK, but it's definitely not, the norm on the main roster because crowds get bored so easily nowadays. Rollins also admits that when he first arrived in Ring of Honor, he didn't feel he'd be a good fit for the promotion. He thought, he would really stick out like a sore thumb. He didn't think that he'd be right for Ring of Honor, but he talks about the match that he had with Nigel that really helped him stand out in the company when he first started. Nigel also talks about the match that he had on Sunday Night Heat back, I think, in 2004, 2005. He was another one where he felt like he didn't belong in WWE or wrestling in the States because the styles were so different between Ring of Honor, WWE, England, America. Like, it was so different. It was so night and day at that point. He didn't feel like he belonged at that point in time in WWE, in the States, etc., etc. Cesaro brings that up. He says that NXT is really what Ring of Honor... NXT now is really what Ring of Honor used to be in the mid-2000s. And NXT was really the pioneer of evolving that style and bringing that style over from Ring of Honor to the independent scene to WWE, to a more mainstream audience. And Rollins also said a lot like when he arrived in Ring of Honor, he was very intimidated when he arrived in WWE in like 2010. I don't know exactly when he signed. Was it 09, 2010, 2011, something like that? I think it was 2010. Anyway, so he talked about when he first arrived in WWE, how he felt like he would stick out like a sore thumb because the people that were there at that time down in developmental could not do what he could do. And that's great that he was an amazing wrestler, but if he stuck out too much, then he felt like he would kind of not be... Like, it's a weird thing. That sounds fucking weird to anyone who doesn't know wrestling, but like, if you're better than everyone else in something like this, like you're trained, you're experienced, you have knowledge with what you're doing in terms of the wrestling, and you arrive somewhere like an NXT or an FCW at that point when they would hire people out of a fucking, out of magazines when it came to the women, or like bodybuilders for the men, and they knew nothing about wrestling. So because Rollins was so exceptionally better than everyone else, he felt like that would put heat on him. Thankfully, that never... I mean, I guess he did have heat at the time for, like, attitude issues because he was really confident in his abilities, but again, that's a different story for a different day. He was just hoping that the style that WWE was working down in developmental on the main roster at that point in time would change over time. And that was exactly what happened. No more than a year or two later, NXT really adopted that style that Ring of Honor had in the mid-2000s. And Rollins outright gave a lot of credit, not just to Daniel Bryan, but CM Punk too. Because Bryan and Punk were the first two, not just Ring of Honor guys, but like the first two smaller guys. And again, another Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. But I'm talking about like in the 2010s, when the only guys that would really be focused on were Randy Orton, who is not a huge guy, but he's really tall. He has it in his blood. He has a wrestling family, blah, blah, blah. John Cena, Batista, Triple H, The Undertaker. It really wasn't until Bryan and Punk came around, specifically Punk in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s, that WWE started to change their perception of how they viewed smaller wrestlers and really started to focus on them for their in-ring ability. And we also see clips of Bryan and Punk wrestling each other, not in Ring of Honor, but in WWE when they had that awesome feud in 2012. And I completely agree. Had it not been for Punk and Bryan breaking through that glass ceiling in like late 2010, early 2011, 2012, I don't think we would see the stars on top today that we do had it not been for them. Rollins and Cesaro talk about how Ring of Honor gave them a lot of experience and really got them ready for what they would, come to experience in WWE. Rollins says that his goal was always WWE, which doesn't surprise me. You watch documentaries on Rollins, he was always a huge WWE fan, so it's not really much of a shocker to find out that WWE was always his endgame. Cesaro, not that he was one of those people who said, I don't need to go to WWE. He never really thought that I guess he would ever really get there. He started out in Switzerland. His goal was just to get to the States. Then his goal became just to wrestle more. Then his goal was to, again, wrestle in the States, stuff like that. He started in Ring of Honor. Then his goal became, I want to make a living out of this. And then he's like, it would be cool to go to WWE. So he didn't realize that he wanted to be there, even though he grew up watching it, until much later on. He didn't realize until he was in Ring of Honor, hey, maybe going to WWE would be cool. And he didn't really know if he would be a success or not. He didn't want to be a disappointment, but he also said that he thought he'd be gone from Switzerland for 3 years. They asked him, hey, how long do you think you'll be gone in the States? And he's like, hey, I'll give it 3 years. If it doesn't work out, I'll be back. And obviously he didn't go back because he didn't have to, because he was a success story. Nigel, this is a very interesting quote, and I completely agree, in addition to other things. But Nigel says that the biggest thing that held Ring of Honor back, at least at that point in time, was money. They didn't have money. They had TV, but not like AEW arriving on TNT. You know what I mean? That they didn't have the money. And he says that, yeah, they have the money now, and that's great, but I feel like it came too little too late. They had the money now to an extent. I mean, they gained a lot of money when they lost the Elite because they had a lot of money to spend on other people, and they brought in Roosh, and they brought in Jeff Cobb, and so many great talents, Tracy Williams, Juice Robinson, PJ Black, but they just don't have any buzz. They had the buzz 10, 15 years ago, but, like AEW has the buzz, and they're able to maintain that buzz because they have the TV deal. They have the exposure. Ring of Honor didn't have that exposure. They didn't have the TV deal, and the production value was fucking terrible, and to an extent today, it still is. They had the money, but they're not using it in the right places. They had a big lighting issue with their major shows, even up until a couple of years ago. You would watch pay-per-views of Ring of Honors, and it would just be fucking Bush League stuff. Like, you make fun of TNA, not Ring of Honor, but like anyone, myself included, would make fun of TNA for like, they're Bush League, they don't have the crowds. Well, neither does Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor is now in that same exact boat. But anyway, going back on a more positive note, Nigel actually compares, which is, very easy to see, Ring of Honor to ECW and how it led stars to WWE like a Rob Van Dam, like a Taz, Kurt Angle, Eddie, Chris Benoit, the list goes on and on and on. And Rollins says that Ring of Honor, ECW, always allowed wrestlers to express themselves, and that helped in the development of their characters, in-ring abilities, and so on and so forth. Rollins even said, winning the Ring of Honor Championship allowed me to win this, talking about the Universal Championship. And had he not won the Ring of Honor title, he wouldn't have known to, how to represent other wrestlers, represent the people in the back, how to carry himself like a professional. He wouldn't have known that he was capable of handling that pressure of being the top guy, and that's why he is where he is today. And he knew if he could do it in Ring of Honor, he could do it anywhere. So then they close out the episode, and I love this. And it makes Nigel so happy to be able to do this for an audience. So we see Nigel doing magic, okay? Nigel does this magic trick where he makes the straw move inside of a cup. And it doesn't sound exciting, but when you watch it, it's pretty fucking cool. So he does that. Cesaro says, I've never seen this guy fail once. Even when he pretends to fail, I've never seen him actually fail. And then they end the episode on Nigel doing a card trick. So he does a card trick where he thinks you have a card that you don't actually have. He does the sleight of hand where he, switches the card when you're least expecting it or when you don't see it, blah, blah, blah. It's just amazing. Rollins and Cesaro are both blown away. I'm impressed. I love his magic tricks. It's really cool to see. And it makes Nigel really, really happy. You cannot wipe that smile off of his face, which was awesome to see. But that would do it for the Table of Honor episode of Table for 3. I love this. The footage that Ring of Honor lent WWE to use in this episode was amazing. Really cool to see that. The pictures, the history, the matches, everything about this episode I thought was just tremendous. Even if you're not a Ring of Honor fan, I would still recommend checking out this episode to get familiar with Ring of Honor, at least what it used to be 10, 15 years ago and how it led guys like Cesaro, like Seth Rollins, like Nigel, like AJ Styles, like Samoa Joe, Roderick Strong, Adam Cole, the list goes on and on and on, how it led them to WWE. Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens. Again, there's a lot more people in WWE NXT now that were in Ring of Honor that you probably don't realize. It's amazing how many people went from Ring of Honor, cut their teeth there, to later WWE. But anyway, be sure to check this out on the WWE Network, Table of Honor featuring Cesaro, Seth Rollins, and Nigel McGuinness. And thank you guys for checking out this episode of WWE Network and Chill. Very much appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, guys, I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.